When someone dies by suicide, the question we often ask is why? The answer is rarely so simple, but decades of research shows that one of the most powerful predictors isn't just depression or hopelessness, it's trauma, especially the kind that happens early in life before the brain and body have learned how to cope. So with this, what are adverse childhood experiences? So in the late 1990s, researchers Vincent Felitti and Robert Andy surveyed over 17,000 participants through the CDC Kaiser Permanente study. They asked about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So that goes something like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional household, such as parental abuse, parental substance abuse, mental illness, or incarceration. And what they found was that over 60% of people had at least one ACE, and 1 in 6 had 4 or more. And the higher the ACE score, the higher the risk for almost every negative health outcome, including suicidal ideation and attempts. For example, people with 4 or more ACEs are 10 to 12 times more likely to attempt suicide than those with none. So how does trauma alter the body and mind? Trauma is not just a nasty unpleasant memory, it's a physiological imprint. Repeated exposure to stress during development can sensitize the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, our body's main stress system, and disrupt neurotransmitters involved in mood regulations such as serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Neuroimaging studies show that people with early trauma often have a hyperactive amygdala, which is our threat detection center, a smaller hippocampus involved in memory and stress regulation, and reduced connectivity in the prefrontal cortex, which manages impulse control and decision making. So these biological changes makes an individual more vulnerable to intense emotional pain and less able to regulate it, which can make suicidal thoughts more likely when life stressors accumulate. So during the Pioneer Research Institute, my professor introduced me to the diathesis stress model, which in this case helps us understand why not everyone with trauma attempts suicide. So the diathesis stress model helps explain why some trauma survivals become suicidal while others don't. In this model, diathesis is a biological or psychological vulnerability, such as genetic predisposition or emotional dysregulation, with stress being external triggers such as abuse, loss, or rejection. When both of these interact, risk skyrockets to very high levels. For instance, people with genetic vulnerabilities in serotonin transporter genes are more reactive to stressful events and show higher rates of depression and suicidality after trauma exposure. So trauma doesn't by itself cause suicide, it rather increases risk through stress sensitization, with each new stressor feeling heavier than it should be. However, to keep in mind, adult trauma isn't just limited to childhood. Adults exposed to intimate partner violence, sexual assault, combat, or chronic workplace abuse also face dramatically higher rates of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. For example, up to 50% of individuals with PTSD report suicidal ideation. Among survivors of sexual assault particularly, 1 in 3 report a suicide attempt at some point in life. Even when trauma is decades old, it can resurface through flashbacks, guilt, or emotional numbing, eroding one's ability to connect, trust, or find meaning. Now, to go even further past adulthood trauma, the risk doesn't stop with just one generation. Children of trauma survivors, including refugees or parents with PTSD, can inherit heightened stress reactivity and maladaptive coping styles. Epigenetic research shows trauma can alter how genes related to stress regulation are expressed in offspring. This helps explain why suicide risk can cluster in families or communities marked by chronic violence, poverty, or discrimination. So now we move on to prevention, healing the stress system. The good news is that early intervention works. Therapies such as trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and EMDR can help desensitize traumatic memories and rebuild emotion regulation skills. Community level prevention such as safe housing, access to health care, and trauma informed education can reduce adverse childhood exposure in the first place. And at a societal level, reducing stigma, screening for trauma, and expanding access to therapy are among the most effective suicide prevention strategies we have. So now moving on to the closing. Trauma changes people, but understanding how it changes them can save lives. Learning about adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care isn't just for psychologists, psychiatrists, or mental health professionals. It's something everyone can benefit from knowing. Because of every act of empathy, every act of kindness and compassion, every safe environment, every supportive conversation can help interrupt the chain of reaction that turns pain into a tragedy. Thank you very much for watching.